Good evening. I'm Rick Pierce from the Chicago Tribune, in tonight for Paul, and this is our nightly look at politics around your city, state, and nation. We begin tonight in Chicago's suburbs, where a cancer-causing chemical is again a source of concern for local residents. Last week, tests showed elevated levels of ethylene oxide near the Medline Industries plant in Waukegan. The known carcinogen is commonly used to sterilize medical equipment or to manufacture other industrial chemicals. Earlier this year, the Sterigenics plant in Willowbrook was shut down for pumping the gas into the air. And last week, Governor Pritzker signed into law new restrictions on the chemical's use. But the Illinois EPA isn't going that far in Waukegan just yet, saying it will continue tests in Lake County through July. My next guest has called on Medline to suspend operations until emissions have been reduced to safe levels. He's also authored an amendment he hopes will help fund public outreach in communities facing ethylene oxide emissions. Congressman Brad Schneider is a Democrat from Illinois' 10th District, serving most of Lake County, from Highland Park to Waukegan and all the way out to Round Lake. Congressman, thank you for joining me this evening.
Rick, it's a great to be with you.
So with some fanfare in the suburbs closer to Sterigenics, we had Governor Pritzker sign legislation dealing with the issue of Sterigenics plant in Willowbrook. What are you trying to do in Washington, and what isn't being done in the case of Medline that was being done with Sterigenics?
Thank you for the question. Well, first, let me say that I commend Governor Pritzker. I'm pleased that he has signed this legislation, that the state legislature passed the legislation. Illinois now has the strictest limits in the country on this chemical ethylene oxide, or ETO, and this is a step in the right direction. We first learned about this last year when the news broke about Sterigenics and the fact that there were two plants in Lake County that also used ethylene oxide. At that time, we made a direct outreach to the U.S. EPA and said we need to do the same thing in Lake County, the same steps in Lake County that are being taken in Willowbrook, specifically ambient air testing. And I was joined by both senators, Senator Durbin, Senator Duckworth, as well as my colleagues, Representative Underwood, Kasten, as well, Lipinski, and Foster. We all reached out to the EPA. We sent letters saying we need to get this testing in place. Unfortunately, the U.S. EPA has refused to take that step. I've written letters. I even saw Director Wheeler in an airport and walked up to him directly and said, we need to have this ambient air testing. But the U.S. EPA has refused to do that. So that put the burden on the local community. And Lake County and Gurnee Waukegan made the investment to do the ambient air testing. That's taking place now. Those measurements are beginning to come in. And in the meantime, I introduced legislation in two appropriations bills. The first one was $5.6 million for the U.S. government to help fund these ambient air tests around the country wherever ETO is being used. The second one is money for the EPA, U.S. EPA, to get out into the communities and talk to residents, to listen to what they have to say, but also share what EPA is doing. In addition, we're calling on the EPA to issue new rules based on the transition of the definition of ETO from a possible carcinogen to a known carcinogen. That happened in 2016. It's been almost 2.5 years. It's much too late. We need to get this in place.
Well, it seems like Sterigenics did teach some lessons, both at the local level as well as the national level. Why was Director Wheeler saying that the U.S. EPA wasn't willing to engage in these ambient air studies?
That's a great question, and we have continued to ask him that question. The community asked that question. His answer has always been, we have these dispersion models that they use that basically takes what's estimated to come out of the smokestack of a factory using ETO, looks at wind dynamics and estimates where the smokestack emissions would go. But we know there's more than smokestack emissions. There's smokestack emissions, but also fugitive emissions coming out in various places. We want to know exactly what is in the communities, and that's why the ambient air testing is so important and why we've put so much pressure on Director Wheeler and the EPA to take the step. We will continue to put that pressure on them. In the meantime, the local communities are bearing the burden, footing the bill, but at least we're getting the numbers in.
Well, what's the status of your legislation as far as trying to help reimburse those local communities as well as the outreach portion?
Thank you. So the two amendments were included in the legislation that has now passed the House. We have actually passed 9 of the 12 appropriations bills that need to go to the Senate and ultimately to the President. But until legislation is picked up in the Senate, it won't become law. So, on all these bills, I'm looking to the Senate, Majority Leader McConnell, to pick up this legislation. 100 bills waiting for Senate action at this point, but especially on these appropriation bills, let's get the government funded so we don't have a shutdown in the fall, but also so we can get the funding to these communities that are doing the testing.
I was going to say there's always quite a logjam in the Senate in recent years, but one bill that was acted on in the House-passed bill was with the border funding provisions that the House sent to the Senate. Senate rejected that,
right.
Passed their own version overwhelmingly. And now the word coming out of the Senate Republican leadership is that it's basically a take it or leave it to the Democrat-controlled House and Speaker Pelosi, that we're not willing to negotiate or send the bills to conference.
Yeah, you touched on two challenges. The first challenge is we do have this situation at the border, this horrible, awful situation with children being separated from the parents, being kept in awful conditions. It is, without question, a humanitarian crisis, and we need to provide the funds so that we can take care of the situation at the border, secure our border, but also treat with dignity and care these young people. As you mentioned, a bill passed the House yesterday. A separate bill passed the Senate today. The second problem that you touch on is we need to get away from this our way or the highway. The Senate and the House should come together. We should be able to find a common solution, a package that will fund the needs we have at the border and send it to the President for his signature so we can do this. And we need to do it immediately. It can't wait till after the 4th of July holiday. We should do this before we leave town this week.
Well, despite the overwhelming Senate vote of their version, there seems to be no guarantee that that's something that the President would sign either.
Again, part of the challenge. And we have these co-equal branches of government. There's a reason the founders, I think, put the Congress as Article 1, defining the legislation is our responsibility. We need to work with the administration. But we, especially here in the House, where there's 430 representatives, we are the closest representatives to the people. That we craft in conjunction with the Senate, the compromises we can make. We really are looking for the administration to work with us, not just on funding at the border, but infrastructure. There's so many issues that we should be working on, and we need to get past the partisanship and work together to do what's right for the American people.
But speaking of partisanship, there was the announcement by House Democrats today that former Special Counsel Robert Mueller would be testifying before a joint committee in the House and doing so publicly in July. Here again, we touch on that issue of where leadership stands, and now we're up to 80 individual members that have called for at least an impeachment inquiry into this presidency. Where does Mueller's public testimony, he's already said that he won't say anything more than what he's had issued in his report, but where does that testimony fit into things?
Well, I think you got to separate the things. There's no reason that Congress can't do its constitutional responsibility of oversight at the same time while it does its constitutional responsibility for legislating and governing. The two then go together. With respect to Special Counsel Mueller coming to speak on July 17th, I think it's important that Congress continue the process he started. The Special Counsel's report didn't tie the loose ends in Volume 2. It said there are 11 possible cases of obstruction. He didn't take them to the conclusion. He said that's really up to Congress. I think Congress has to follow the paths, the roadmap that the Special Counsel laid out, tie those loose ends, and I've been very clear. I'm committed to following the facts where they lead us, but our responsibility is to the Constitution and to the truth, and I think the Special Counsel coming to speak is a step in the process of getting to the truth.
Congressman Brad Schneider, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Rick, thank you. It was a pleasure, and look forward to talking to you again soon. Have a great night.
Coming up next, how local